the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
At first, the words sounded like another urgent royal headline, the kind that flashes across screens and makes the entire room go quiet. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, had supposedly broken his silence on King Charles III's shocking exit. But behind that phrase sat a far deeper question. Was this truly an ending, or the first visible sign of a monarchy preparing for change? For generations, the British royal family has understood one uncomfortable truth better than almost any institution in the world. Power does not always move with loud declarations. Sometimes it moves through absence. Sometimes it moves through a shortened schedule, a softer public statement, a carefully chosen photograph, or the quiet appearance of an heir beside the sovereign at exactly the moment the nation begins asking what comes next. That is why this latest claim surrounding King Charles III and Prince William has caught so much attention. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed any permanent departure from the throne, and there has been no official announcement suggesting that the king has abandoned his constitutional role. What has been confirmed in the past is that Charles has faced cancer treatment, that his public-facing duties were adjusted under medical advice, and that the monarchy has had to operate under unusual pressure. But in royal life, even a temporary adjustment can carry a symbolic weight far beyond the schedule itself. And that is where the story begins to tighten. Because when people hear the phrase, King Charles's shocking exit, they do not simply think of one man stepping away from an event. They think of the crown. They think of succession. They think of Prince William, the future king, no longer standing only in the background, but moving closer to the center of national attention. They think of Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose own public journey has carried its own emotional significance. And they think of Queen Camilla, who has spent years beside Charles through judgment, controversy, recovery, and reinvention, now facing the possibility that the reign she helped support may look different from the one many expected. But was this really about one dramatic statement, or was it about something more gradual, more delicate, and perhaps more revealing? Royal observers often say that the monarchy speaks in layers. The official statement gives the public one version. The timetable gives another. The body language gives another still. And then there is the silence, which can sometimes be the most revealing part of all. If Prince William has appeared more visible, more serious, or more central in recent royal moments, that does not automatically mean a formal transfer of power has taken place. But it does invite a question that many royal watchers are now asking with greater urgency. How does an ancient institution prepare for uncertainty without alarming the public it depends upon? This is not a simple matter of family emotion. It is a question of public trust. King Charles III waited longer than any heir in British history to become monarch. His reign has always carried a sense of delayed destiny, shaped by decades of preparation, duty, criticism, and patience. For many supporters of the monarchy, Charles represents continuity after the long reign of Queen Elizabeth II, a bridge between the familiar past and a more complicated modern future. So when any report suggests that he may be stepping back, even temporarily, it touches something far deeper than the health of one royal figure. It touches the emotional security of the crown itself, and Prince William understands that better than most. The Prince of Wales is not simply a son watching his father face a difficult chapter. He is also the man expected one day to inherit the full weight of the institution. Every word he says about the king, every public gesture of support, every moment of visible steadiness is read through two lenses at once. On one side, he is a devoted son. On the other, he is the future monarch being quietly measured by the public before his time has formally arrived. That dual role is what makes this moment so sensitive. If William speaks too emotionally, some may see a family in distress. If he speaks too firmly, others may wonder whether a transition is already underway. If he says nothing, speculation grows in the silence. And if he appears too prepared, the very quality that reassures the nation can also make the story feel more serious. This is the impossible balance of royal duty: comfort the public without revealing too much, protect the king without hiding reality, and prepare for the future without making the present look fragile. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, the symbolism is just as powerful. Her role beside William is no longer viewed only through the language of elegance, family, and public affection. Increasingly, She is seen as part of the monarchy's emotional architecture, someone whose calm presence helps soften moments that might otherwise feel stark or institutional. When the future king appears under pressure, the future queen's steadiness becomes part of the message. Not because she speaks over the story, but because her presence suggests continuity, unity, and restraint. Yet beneath that image of calm, there is also a human question. How much can one family absorb while still presenting composure to the world? Queen Camilla's position adds another layer. 4 years, she has been one of the most scrutinized women in royal history, eventually becoming a central source of support for Charles. To imagine the king stepping back from any part of his role is also to imagine Camilla's carefully built place within the monarchy shifting again. Her public image has depended on loyalty, endurance, and proximity to the king. If Charles becomes less visible, the question becomes not only what happens to his duties, but what happens to the emotional structure around him. And this is why the story cannot be treated as a simple headline. The monarchy is not built only on crowns, carriages, and palace balconies. It is built on perception. It survives because people believe in continuity, even when the individuals inside it are vulnerable. It survives because the public can see change happening slowly enough to feel stable. But when illness, age, public pressure, and succession all meet at once, even the smallest movement can appear larger than intended. That may be the real reason this reported moment has stirred such intense reaction. It is not because anyone knows the full truth behind palace doors. It is because the public senses that the reign of King Charles III exists under pressures unlike any modern monarch before him. He inherited the throne after a lifetime of waiting, but he also inherited it at a time when the royal family was already facing questions about relevance, family division, public cost, and the future shape of the institution. So when Prince William is said to have broken his silence, viewers are not only listening for what he may have said, they are listening for what the words might reveal about the monarchy's next chapter. Was it reassurance or preparation? Was it family loyalty or institutional duty? Was it simply a son standing beside his father? Or was it the first emotional sign that the future king is already being asked to carry more than the public can see? For now, the answer remains carefully guarded behind palace walls. But one thing is clear, the conversation has changed. The focus is no longer only on King Charles's health, nor only on William's future. It is on the fragile space between the two, where a father's reign, a son's destiny, and the monarchy's need for stability all meet in silence. And to understand why this moment feels so important, we have to look more closely at what Prince William's silence may have been protecting before it finally appeared to break. What that silence may have been protecting was not one simple secret, but a fragile arrangement between duty, health, image, and succession. In royal life, a public message is rarely only a message. It is a signal to the country, a reassurance to the Commonwealth, a warning to critics, and sometimes a carefully measured bridge between what the palace can say and what the public already suspects. That is why William's position became so difficult. The Prince of Wales could not speak as an ordinary son because every sentence connected to his father would be heard as a statement about the crown. He could not speak as a detached future monarch either because the nation would have noticed the coldness immediately. He had to stand in the narrowest space of all, close enough to show love, steady enough to show leadership, and careful enough not to suggest that the monarchy was entering a crisis it was not ready to define. According to royal commentators, this is often where the modern monarchy faces its hardest test. Not in grand ceremonies, not on balcony appearances, and not even during public celebrations, but in those uncertain periods when private vulnerability begins to affect public expectation. A king may still be king. A palace may still function. The flags may still fly, the statements may still be issued, and the official language may still remain calm. But once people begin watching for signs of transition, everything changes. Every absence becomes a clue. Every appearance becomes a measurement. Every supportive word from William becomes part of a much larger question. And that question is no longer simply about Charles. It is about how much responsibility the future king is already expected to carry. For William, the challenge is not only constitutional, it is emotional. He has spent his life knowing that one day the crown would come closer, but there is a difference between preparing for destiny in theory and feeling its shadow arrive through family pain. Royal watchers often speak about succession as if it is a clean line on a chart, one name following another, one generation replacing the last. But inside a family, succession is not clean. It is personal. It asks a son to imagine the moment when his father can no longer stand at the center in the same way. It asks a wife to watch her husband's place in public life become more fragile. It asks a future queen to become a symbol of steadiness even when the household around her may be carrying private strain. This is why Catherine's role matters more than it may first appear. She does not need to dominate the story to influence the meaning of it. Her presence beside William has increasingly become a form of reassurance in itself, a visual promise that the next chapter of the monarchy would not be built on ambition alone, but on family, restraint, and continuity. Some observers believe that the public's affection for Catherine gives William a softer landing at moments when his duties become heavier. If the Prince of Wales represents the future authority of the crown, Catherine helps represent its emotional stability. But that creates pressure of its own. When the monarchy leans on a figure for reassurance, it also asks the public to read that person as a sign. A smile becomes more than a smile. A carefully timed appearance becomes more than an appearance. A moment of quiet support can be interpreted as strength, unity, or even preparation. And if palace watchers are right that the institution is becoming more dependent on William and Catherine as symbols of continuity, then the story is not just about a father and son. It is about the monarchy slowly rearranging its center of gravity. That possibility is what makes Queen Camilla's position so sensitive. Camilla's public journey has always been tied closely to Charles, not only as his wife, but as someone whose royal standing grew through his reign. She has become a visible part of the monarchy's present, but if Charles's role is reduced in any way, even temporarily, questions naturally arise about how her own influence, duties, and public identity might adjust. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed any dramatic internal shift, and it would be wrong to claim one as fact. Still, in royal commentary, perception often matters almost as much as formal authority. Was Camilla watching a temporary health adjustment, or the early signs of a reign being forced to rely more heavily on the next generation? Was William simply offering support, or was the institution quietly asking him to become the public face of stability sooner than anyone expected? These are not questions the palace is likely to answer directly, but they are the questions that give the story its deeper power. Because the monarchy's strength has always depended on its ability to make change feel continuous. After Queen Elizabeth II, the country was not only accepting a new monarch, it was adjusting to the end of an era that had lasted for most people's entire lives. Charles inherited not just a throne, but a national memory. His reign was always going to be watched with sensitivity, measured against his mother's legacy, and judged by how successfully he could carry the institution into a more uncertain age. That is why any suggestion of a reduced royal role feels larger than it might in another family. If a public figure cancels events, people may call it a personal matter. If a monarch adjusts duties, people begin thinking about continuity. The crown is designed to appear larger than the person who wears it, yet it is still carried by human beings with bodies, fears, limits, and private griefs. That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire moment. William's silence, then, may not have been emptiness. It may have been discipline. A controlled pause while the palace measured how much could be said, how much should be held back, and how much the public could already feel without being told. But silence can only hold for so long. Eventually, the people looking toward the Prince of Wales begin asking whether his restraint is protecting his father, protecting the monarchy, or protecting the country from a truth that has not yet been fully shaped into words. And once that possibility enters the conversation, the story moves into far more sensitive territory. Because behind every carefully managed royal statement is another question, one the palace may prefer to leave unspoken for as long as possible. If William is already becoming the steadying force, who inside the royal household gains influence as the king steps further from the center. That question cuts to the heart of the monarchy's most delicate problem. Influence is not always announced. It is revealed by who is asked to appear, who is trusted to speak, who stands closest to the sovereign, and who begins to carry the emotional weight of the crown before any formal change is ever declared. And if William is now being watched as the steadying force, the next mystery becomes unavoidable. Who else inside the royal structure begins to move with him? This is where the story becomes larger than one reported statement. Because the monarchy is not only a family, and it is not only a public institution. It is a network of households, advisors, senior royals, private offices, public expectations, and old loyalties that have been shaped over decades. When the center of that network appears to shift, even slightly, everyone connected to it feels the pressure. Some adjust quickly, some resist quietly, others understand before the public does that a new royal rhythm may already be forming. According to royal commentators, the most important changes inside a royal household often begin long before the public is given language for them. A different royal takes on a visible role. A familiar figure appears less frequently. A spouse becomes more central. A younger generation is positioned more carefully. None of these movements alone proves a formal transition. But together, they create a pattern. And patterns inside the royal family matter because the palace has always understood that the public reads continuity through repetition. For William, that pattern is especially complicated. He must never appear impatient for a role that depends on his father's decline. Yet he must also never appear unprepared for the responsibility that may come closer at any moment. That is a difficult line for any heir, but for this future king, the burden is intensified by modern visibility. Every expression is captured, every absence is debated, every carefully worded message is dissected not only for what it says, but for what it refuses to say. And this is where Catherine's influence becomes more significant. Some royal watchers believe her role beside William is no longer just supportive in the traditional sense. It may now be strategic in a quieter, more emotional way. Catherine offers the monarchy something that official statements cannot, a sense of calm that feels personal rather than procedural. When the institution needs to appear steady, her presence helps soften the harder edges of power. She represents family life, continuity, restraint, and the promise that the future of the crown will still feel human. But there is a hidden cost to that symbolism. The more the monarchy relies on William and Catherine to reassure the public, the more their private lives become tied to institutional survival. Their marriage, their parenting, their public composure, and even their silences become part of the national story. For any family, that would be pressure. For the future king and queen, it becomes a form of preparation that never fully switches off. And if this reported moment around Charles has shown anything, it is that preparation can arrive not as a ceremony, but as a crisis. Queen Camilla's place in this picture is more complex. Her loyalty to Charles has become one of the defining features of his later life and reign. She has stood through years of judgment and eventual acceptance, becoming not merely the king's wife, but a visible anchor beside him. Yet if William and Catherine are increasingly seen as the future face of stability, Camilla may find herself in a more sensitive position. Not because she has lost importance, but because her importance is tied to a monarch whose public role has faced strain. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed any internal division over this, and it would be unfair to suggest a conflict as fact. But observers have speculated that moments like this can create quiet emotional tension, even when everyone involved understands the practical necessity. Camilla may wish to protect Charles from being seen as diminished. William may feel responsible for protecting the crown from looking uncertain. Catherine may be trying to hold the family image together while avoiding any appearance of replacing the present with the future too quickly. Each role carries loyalty. Each loyalty points in a slightly different direction. That is what makes the royal dynamic so difficult to read from the outside. The same action can carry two meanings. If William steps forward, it can be seen as duty. It can also be seen as a sign that the institution is preparing for what comes next. If Camilla remains close to Charles, it can be seen as devotion. It can also remind the public of how personal this chapter has become. If Catherine appears calm, it reassures viewers, but it also raises expectations that the next generation is already capable of carrying the monarchy through uncertainty. Was this about personal loyalty, or was the institution quietly protecting itself? The answer may be both, and that is why the story feels so charged. Royal families do not experience private pain in private ways. Their grief, their illness, their disagreements, and their transitions are filtered through history. A father's reduced role becomes a constitutional concern. A son's steadiness becomes a national signal. A wife's silence becomes a symbol. A future queen's composure becomes part of the monarchy's defense. There is also a historical echo that cannot be ignored. The royal family has survived by adapting without appearing to surrender. After abdication, it rebuilt trust. After personal scandals, it leaned on duty. After the death of Queen Elizabeth II, it depended on continuity. Now, in this more uncertain chapter, the monarchy may be facing a different kind of test: how to prepare the public for change while insisting that nothing essential has broken. That is why the reported focus on William matters. He is not simply being viewed as the next name in the line of succession. He is being measured as the person who may have to translate a painful family reality into a public sense of order. And if the palace is careful, that transition can look dignified. But if the balance is misread, sympathy can turn into anxiety, and reassurance can begin to sound like concealment. By this point, the pieces begin to connect. Charles represents the emotional difficulty of a reign under pressure. William represents the burden of an heir becoming more central before the final moment has arrived. Catherine represents the calm the public wants to believe in. Camilla represents the human cost of watching authority and intimacy move in different directions. Together, they form a picture that is far more complicated than a single headline. But even that does not explain the most sensitive part of a story. Because the real question is no longer whether William is being prepared for greater responsibility. It is whether one particular development forced the palace to understand that preparation could no longer remain hidden in the background. That development, according to some royal watchers, was not a single dramatic announcement from the palace, but the moment when the public began treating William's presence not merely as support for the king, but as evidence of a future already moving closer. In royal terms, that distinction matters enormously. Support is temporary, preparation is structural, and once the public begins to see the heir not only beside the monarch but increasingly carrying the emotional weight of the institution, the entire story changes shape. The palace may never describe it in such direct language. Buckingham Palace is built on restraint, and royal communication is often designed to calm rather than expose. But observers have noted that the monarchy's most important transitions are rarely understood in real time. They are noticed later, when people look back and realize that the symbols were already changing before the official words arrived. A royal diary adjusts. A senior figure appears in a more prominent position. Another voice becomes the one the public listens to most carefully. At first, each detail looks separate. Then the pattern begins to form. That is why this moment feels more serious than ordinary speculation. It is not only about whether Charles is seen less often, or whether William is seen more often. It is about the message created when those two movements happen at the same time. A monarch whose reign began under the shadow of extraordinary expectation now faces questions about limitation. An heir who was meant to represent the future is increasingly asked to reassure the present. And between them sits the institution itself, trying to appear steady while adapting to a reality it may not yet want to name too clearly. For Charles, the consequence is deeply personal. The king has spent his life preparing for a role that came late, and every reduction in visibility risks being interpreted as something larger than a medical adjustment or a practical change. Even when palace language remains careful, public perception can move faster than official explanation. The danger is not only that people worry about his health. The greater danger is that they begin to emotionally relocate the monarchy's center before the king himself has finished defining his reign. That is a painful position for any sovereign. A monarch does not simply perform duties. A monarch embodies continuity. To step back from even part of that public rhythm can feel, to observers, like a symbolic thinning of authority. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed any permanent exit from kingship, and it is important not to treat reported claims as established fact. But the emotional effect of this conversation is already real. The public is no longer asking only how Charles is doing. Many are asking how much of the monarchy's visible future now rests on William. And that pressure brings the Prince of Wales into the most difficult stage of his public life so far. If he appears confident, some may read it as reassurance. Others may read it as readiness. If he appears cautious, some may praise his loyalty. Others may wonder whether the palace is concealing the scale of the transition. This is the impossible theater of monarchy. Every gesture carries meaning, even when the person making it may simply be trying to do what is right. Royal commentators often point out that heirs are judged twice. They are judged for their loyalty to the monarch they serve, and they are judged for their capacity to become the monarch they will one day be. William is now caught between those two judgments in a way that feels unusually exposed. He must protect his father's dignity without appearing passive. He must show leadership without appearing to reach for power. He must steady the institution without making the current reign look unstable. That is not just a public relations challenge. It is a test of character, timing, and restraint. Catherine's role in this escalation is subtle but important. Her presence beside William can soften the image of transition, turning what might look like a stark institutional shift into something more human, more familial, and more reassuring. Yet the more the public looks to her for calm, the more the burden expands around her. She becomes part of the monarchy's emotional reassurance strategy, whether or not anyone says it aloud. A future queen is not only expected to appear composed, she is expected to make uncertainty look survivable. Camilla faces a different kind of consequence. If Charles becomes less visible in any sustained way, even without a formal change in kingship, her own public role enters a more delicate phase. She remains central to the king's personal world, but the public focus may increasingly move toward William and Catherine as symbols of continuity. That does not mean Camilla is being pushed aside, and it would be wrong to claim that without evidence. But royal history shows that perception can shift before titles do. Influence can remain, while attention moves elsewhere. And if attention is moving, the palace has to manage not only what is happening, but what people believe is happening. That may be the most urgent institutional pressure of all. The monarchy cannot allow the public to feel confused about who is leading, who is representing stability, or where the emotional center of the family now sits. Confusion creates speculation. Speculation creates anxiety. And anxiety, inside a modern monarchy, can become more dangerous than any single headline. This is where history becomes instructive. The royal family has survived past moments of crisis not by denying change, but by controlling the way change is understood. After moments of public difficulty, the institution has often returned to familiar themes: duty, service, continuity, and restraint. But this chapter is different because it involves not a scandal that can be managed, nor a dispute that can be softened, but the human limits of a reigning monarch. That makes the palace's task far more delicate. It cannot fight time. It can only frame it. So the major turning point may not be a formal transfer of power. It may be the public realization that William is already being watched as though he carries part of the crown's immediate future. That realization changes everything, because once the audience begins to view the heir through the lens of present responsibility, every royal appearance becomes a test. Every public engagement becomes evidence. Every palace statement is measured for signs of confidence or concealment. Was this simply a reaction to concern over the king, or was it part of a wider institutional calculation? The answer remains carefully guarded, but the consequences are becoming harder to ignore. The monarchy now has to protect Charles's dignity, William's timing, Catherine's steadiness, Camilla's place, and the public's confidence all at once. If any one of those pieces is mishandled, the story could shift from sympathy to uncertainty very quickly. And that is why the reported silence around William matters so much. Silence can preserve unity for a while, but it can also create a space into which the public pours its own fears. When the future king finally speaks, the words must do more than answer curiosity. They must tell the nation whether it is witnessing a temporary strain, a careful adjustment, or the earliest emotional outline of a new royal era. Because the real consequence was not only what happened in that moment, it was what that moment revealed about the future, and whether the monarchy can move toward change without making the country feel that something precious is slipping away. And that is where the meaning of this story becomes clearer, because the deepest issue was never only whether one royal statement was made, or whether one headline captured the full truth. The deeper issue was how a monarchy built on continuity responds when the public begins to sense that continuity is being tested. In that moment, the crown is no longer just an emblem above the family. It becomes a burden carried by real people, each one trying to protect a different part of the same fragile structure. For Charles, the meaning is tied to legacy. A reign does not need to be long to be consequential, but it does need to be understood. The king's challenge has always been different from his mother's. Queen Elizabeth II became a symbol of endurance across generations, while Charles inherited a crown in a more impatient and questioning age. His task has not been simply to occupy the throne, but to prove that monarchy can still adapt without losing its soul. That is why any discussion of him stepping back, even in a limited or temporary sense, immediately becomes larger than health or schedule. It raises the question of how history will remember a king whose reign began late and unfolded under pressure. But for William, the meaning is more immediate. The future monarch is being shaped not only by preparation, but by public expectation. His test is not arriving someday in the distance. It is appearing in fragments now, through moments when people look to him for steadiness before the crown is fully his. That is a different kind of inheritance. It is not ceremonial. It is emotional. It asks him to absorb anxiety, project calm, protect his father's dignity, and avoid making the future seem too eager to replace the present. That balance may define the next stage of the monarchy. If William appears too distant, he risks seeming unready for the role history has set before him. If he appears too central, he risks creating the impression that Charles is already being moved into the past. And if he speaks too plainly, the palace may lose the protection that careful language provides. Yet if he says too little, speculation fills the silence. This is why the Prince of Wales now occupies one of the most delicate spaces in royal life, visible enough to reassure, restrained enough not to alarm, and human enough to remind the country that duty does not erase pain. Catherine's role also takes on greater meaning here. She is not simply standing beside William as a figure of support. She represents the softer face of the future monarchy, the part that must feel familiar, stable, and emotionally accessible to a public that has become less willing to accept royalty as distant mystery. Her calm matters because it tells the audience that whatever changes may come, the next chapter will still carry a sense of family. But that symbolism comes with its own quiet pressure. The more the monarchy depends on her steadiness, the more every public appearance becomes part of a larger reassurance. Camilla's position remains just as revealing, though in a different way. Her story has always been connected to endurance, loyalty, and the long road from public criticism to royal acceptance. In this chapter, she becomes a reminder that institutional change can be emotionally costly, even when it is necessary. If the focus of the monarchy slowly moves toward William and Catherine, Camilla's importance does not disappear, but its meaning may change. She remains connected to Charles's personal strength, while the public's gaze may increasingly move toward the next generation. That is not necessarily rivalry. It may simply be the natural, painful movement of time inside an institution that pretends time can be managed. And perhaps that is the real tension at the center of the story. The monarchy survives by making change appear orderly, but human life rarely moves in such perfect lines. Illness, age, family strain, public expectation, and succession do not wait politely for the right ceremony. They overlap. They create pressure before the official language is ready. They force people to carry roles before those roles are formally handed to them. And in those moments, the House of Windsor reveals both its strength and its vulnerability. What royal observers may be watching next is not only whether Charles appears more or less often. They will be watching the choreography of the family. Who stands where? Who speaks first? Who is sent to represent the crown at sensitive moments? Who carries the message of stability when the mood becomes uncertain? They will watch William's tone, Catherine's visibility, Camilla's place beside the king, and the language Buckingham Palace chooses when reassurance is needed most. In monarchy, the future is often signaled before it is announced. That is why the story matters beyond one reported moment. It shows how public perception can become a force of its own. If people begin to feel that William is already carrying the emotional center of the institution, then the palace must respond to that perception whether it welcomes it or not. If people still look to Charles for reassurance, then his dignity must remain central to the story. And if the monarchy wants to protect confidence, it must avoid allowing the public to feel that the future is arriving through confusion rather than order. The strongest interpretation may be that this is not a collapse, but a careful adjustment under pressure. The more troubling interpretation is that the public is beginning to notice a transition before the palace is prepared to define it. Both readings can exist at the same time, and that is what gives the moment its emotional weight. The monarchy may still be steady, but steadiness now requires more visible effort. It must be performed, protected, and believed. In the end, The significance of William breaking his silence, whether literal, reported, or symbolic, lies in what that silence represented before it ended. It represented restraint. It represented loyalty. It represented the difficult space between truth and reassurance. And when that silence becomes the focus of national attention, it tells us that the audience is no longer watching only the king. They are watching the handover of meaning from one generation to the next. So this chapter does not close with certainty. It closes with a clearer understanding of the pressure now surrounding the crown. Charles remains central to the monarchy's present. William increasingly embodies its future. Catherine helps shape the emotional image of what comes next, and Camilla reflects the personal cost of change. But while this story begins to settle into meaning, the larger royal picture is still moving. Was this simply one sensitive moment around the king's role, or another sign that the balance inside the House of Windsor is slowly shifting? Because as one question begins to soften, another royal development is already waiting in the wings, and it may reveal even more about where the monarchy is heading next.